I mean, it just came out. What, today, yesterday? You must be in a whirlwind.
Yeah, it came out I guess, 11 hours ago. This is 11 a.m. This is yeah, it's all happening today. I feel like the picture of the dogs who like put their faces out of the window and then the wind is just like blowing them, but they're like delighted and they're so happy, but the wind is also like smashing their face. That's how I feel right now. I'm
I know
just like,
I know the feeling, not from
yeah,
book publishing, but just gigging, big
yeah.
gigs, big things, and you just feel, but this is something else. I mean, this is your second book, right? But I mean, this is a big deal. So I'll get right into it with you. And what do we got? What time do you have? What's 11? Can you do like 30 minutes, hopefully?
I can, yeah.
Awesome. I'm really, really enjoying it. And I will ask you, if you don't mind, to read. Do you have it in front of you by chance?
Yep.
Page 6. I don't know enough about writing and literature to say if that's the second or third. I want to say it's the second paragraph. Wouldn't it be? Because
That starts off with what?
New Orleans is my home.
Got it. Should I start off with that?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm gonna just have, because I think it's a fun way to jump into the interview.
Okay.
And we'll go. Whenever you're ready, if you wanted to start reading, I'm recording.
Is just that paragraph?
Yeah, New Orleans is my home.
Okay. Not through the whole thing. End at no to look for it.
Yep.
Got it. New Orleans is my home. It is where I was born and raised. It is part of me in ways I continue to discover. But I came to realize that I knew relatively little about my hometown's relationship to the centuries of bondage rooted in the city's soft earth, in the statues I had walked past daily, the names of the streets I had lived on, the schools I had attended, and the buildings that had once been nothing more to me than the remnants of colonial architecture. It was all right in front of me, even when I didn't know to look for it.
Nailed it. Thanks for reading that, Clint. It's a great place to start. I guess I didn't know that you were from New Orleans, but you were born and raised in New Orleans, huh?
Born and raised. I lived in New Orleans my whole life until my senior year of high school, which was Hurricane Katrina. And so 3 years into my senior year, we evacuated for Katrina, and I finished high school in Houston, Texas, alongside my sister.
So you learn different in public schools all over the country, but certainly in New Orleans than I guess I did in upstate New York. We didn't learn probably a lot about the Civil War, much less slavery, but I definitely am pretty sure that I always thought and believed that the primary reason or cause of the Civil War was about and over slavery. But that's not necessarily what you learn in your public school. Is that right?
Yeah, and I don't even know necessarily that it's limited to public schools. I mean, so in 2018, the Southern Poverty Law Center had a study that showed that only 8% of U.S. high school seniors are able to identify slavery as the central cause of the Civil War. And so you and your school experience in many ways were the exception, unfortunately. I think there are so many young people across the country in public schools and private schools in the South and in the North who don't receive any meaningful engagement with the history of slavery writ large, and then the way that they're taught about the Civil War is as if slavery was a side issue, or was peripheral to the central struggle over states' rights or honoring one's heritage or fighting for one's community. But we obviously cannot understand states' rights without understanding that the central struggle over states' rights was whether or not a state had the right to own human beings, and to perpetuate that practice. So it is something that I didn't learn to the extent that was necessary when I was young. And so much of what animates this book is an attempt to fill in the gaps that I felt were missing, or the gaps that existed in my own childhood, and to give me a language and a history and a framework with which to name and understand and make sense of this country and its history in ways that help explain why the contemporary landscape of inequality looks the way that it does today. Because if you don't understand that, you can fall into the trap of thinking that the reason one community looks one way and another community looks another way is somehow because of the people in those communities, rather than the things that have been done to those communities generation after generation after generation.
Yeah, you write so well said that in the epilogue of the book, you write the history of slavery is the history of the United States. It was not peripheral to our founding; it was central to it. It is not irrelevant to our contemporary society. It created it. This history is in our soil. It's in our policies, and it must too be in our memories. So important, and you do fill those gaps. So many of those gaps in this book. I've learned so much. I'm really, really enjoying it, Clint. But I think, as you can't pick, there's so many different places that you could have gone, and I guess you picked like 12, but you only get to write about how many do we learn about? 8?
8 or 9, yeah.
And I guess I can't pick which ones to talk about, so I'm going to mention all of as many as I can in the time that we have. But I feel like I want to start in Angola because I feel like it's not the most visceral because they're all pretty visceral, and I don't have enough of a vocabulary to use other words, Clint. But tell us about why it's so symbolic. Angola prison, which is also in Louisiana.
So Angola is the largest maximum security prison in the country. It is built on top of a former plantation. It is 18,000 acres wide, bigger than the island of Manhattan. It is a place where 75% of the people held there are Black men. Over 70% of them are serving life sentences. And as I mentioned, it's built on top of a former plantation. And what I tell folks is that if you were to go to Germany and you had the largest maximum security prison in Germany, built on top of a former concentration camp in which the people held there were disproportionately Jewish, that place would so clearly and rightfully be a global emblem of anti-Semitism. It would be abhorrent. It would be disgusting. We would never allow a place like that to exist because it would run counter to all of our moral and ethical sensibilities. People would be protesting outside of it every day, and they should be. But here in the United States, we have the largest maximum security prison in the country, in which the vast majority of people held there are Black men serving life sentences who go out and work in fields that were once a plantation for virtually no pay, while someone watches over them on horseback with a gun over their shoulder. And so part of what I'm exploring when I go to a place like Angola is like, what are the ways that a history of white supremacy not only enacts violence, like physical violence against people's bodies, but also collectively numbs us to certain types of violences that in another context would be wildly unacceptable. And how does that happen? What are the implications for that prison existing, much less existing on that land? And the fact that that prison has a gift shop, right? And that gift shop has paraphernalia like coffee mugs and shot glasses and cigarette and ashtrays made of license plates. And, one of the most horrific things that I saw there was on one of the coffee mugs. There is a silhouette of a watchtower, and on at the top of the watchtower, you see like the silhouette and the little figurine of a guard with their rifle. And above and below the silhouette of this watchtower, it says Angola, a gated community.
Oh,
and so it's not only that this place has a very clear relationship to the history of slavery that it is not at all interrogating or excavating or reckoning with at all, but it is that place continues to belittle and almost make a mockery of the conditions that thousands of people are still living in today in that prison, right? Like you go to Auschwitz or some of these other places in Germany, and they have restaurants, they have museums, they have gift shops, but they are mindful of the history, they are tastefully done, and they also are not places where people continue to be held in bondage or in cages, right? But like this is a place that continues to function as a prison, and that has a museum that doesn't mention slavery, has a gift shop attached to that museum. And part of why that happens is both because the social function of prison is to render people caricatures or invisible, and then also our failure to understand how the history of slavery shaped contemporary mass incarceration is a deep and profound void that we have.
I've already talked about kind of how this book is done and the places that you went, and you've mentioned a lot of why you did it already and what we learned. But I just wanted to ask you about your lineage. How far have you traced back your family?
Yeah, I mean, I've not done as much genealogical work as some others, or as might necessarily be possible. But I think uh, for so many Black folks, it's difficult because Black people were only began to be included in the census in 1870, right? And so for so many of us, even the extent to which we can go back beyond 1870 relies on, newspaper clippings and, journals and diaries left from the families that may have enslaved our families. And, so you find all the sort of extant um, primary source documents and evidence that you can to sort of piece together a history. But for many Black people, you are, you know, excavating in a sort of fog of uncertainty, and you don't know what you'll find or if you'll find anything. So, I mean, I've not the central project of this book was not necessarily genealogical, but I did talk to my grandparents, who were born in 1930 Jim Crow. My grandfather, 1930 Jim Crow apartheid Florida, or 1930 Jim Crow apartheid Mississippi. My grandmother, 1939 Jim Crow apartheid Florida, and got their sort of oral histories, and got an understanding of the stories that had been passed down to them from their grandparents and great grandparents, and it was a reminder of our proximity to that period of time, right? Like my grandfather's grandfather was enslaved. The woman who opened the National Museum of African American History and Culture alongside the Obama family in 2016 was the daughter of an enslaved person.
Yeah.
So this history, we're made to feel as if slavery is this thing that was like in the Jurassic period, right? Where like it was the dinosaurs, it was the Flintstones, and it was slavery. But like there are people alive today who still love and were raised by and knew and were in community with people who were born into bondage. And in the scope of human history, like slavery was just yesterday.
I want to just ask you real quick, just your take on, opinion on what we're seeing right now in our country with this kind of awakening. We could talk about when it started, why it started, the Black Lives Matter movement, which was, of course, very unpopular when it began, but then became public perception of it improved and then kind of peaked and now has gone down a bit as a result of the George Floyd murder and trial, and the trial of the police officer. And I wonder, and now you're hearing all over the country people rejecting history being taught, specifically a history about a racial history, which they know nothing about, most of them, but people are losing their mind. White people in the suburbs where I live, people are losing their mind over racial, radical, critical, race critical. What is it?
Critical race theory.
Jesus. My allergies, critical race theory. And I wonder, given what you learned in this book, given how important it is to get an education, how do you react to the backlash against the education that we're getting, against, I think, teachings like yours?
Yeah. I mean, what's clear is that you have an entire media ecosystem, the entire infrastructure of a political party who is dedicated to preventing as many people as possible from understanding the history of this country. Because if you understand the history of this country, the more in depth you begin to understand that, the less this country is able to lie to you. And the more you understand the history of slavery and the history of racism and all of its manifestations, the more you are able to reject the myth of meritocracy, right? This sort of ethos that shapes the narrative that America has about itself, which is this idea that if you simply work hard, good things will come to you. And if good things have not come to you, it is simply because you haven't worked hard enough or you haven't done something to deserve it. When, as I mentioned, like
illustrated by Black people or any people who rise from poverty to wealth. We just look at those examples, including President Obama, who said that kind of thing himself a lot, and we say, "See, you can make it here." Sorry to interrupt you.
No, and I think that's important, right? Because systems of oppression have always relied on exceptional people to justify and legitimate the otherwise oppressive system, and in some ways, you see that. Even part of what I write about in the book is like having the extent to which I learned about slavery growing up was centered so much around folks like Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, who are extraordinary, extraordinary individuals, but whose lives and circumstances are not reflective of the experience of the millions of enslaved people over the course of more than 2 centuries. And so it is important to study somebody like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, because it is important to see the ways that Black people resisted and the ways that Black people ran away, the ways that Black people and enslaved people, formerly enslaved people, rejected their conditions and did not passively accept what was happening to them.
Right.
But it also, I think, if you are only studying those types of work and people, it can limit your conception and understanding of what resistance even looks like. And it can also not give you a sense of what life was like for the vast majority of enslaved people, because these were like exceptional, not just exceptional enslaved people, these were exceptional individuals, like exceptional human beings. Like there are not a lot of people ever made and walking around on earth like those two. And so I think that that's why it's so important to study not only those types of figures, but also to study the slave narratives from the Federal Writers Project, to also study narratives that understand resistance and the experience of slavery as something that is not predicated on whether or not you ran away or fought against your enslaver. But it is millions and millions of different people doing their very best to try to make a life and make meaning for their lives in the face of unimaginable, like, circumstances that would have been that are unfathomable to so many of us, and who are just trying to build community, to find love, to find purpose in the best way that they know how, in the context that they have been placed in or born into.
So well said is how I want to end or respond to every single one of your responses, because you're so thoughtful. But I also wonder if, as you're talking there, it made me think about, again, the Black Lives Matter movement. And I wonder if it's kind of a purposeful wisdom that there hasn't been, just a few faces of leadership, and that it's very local and organized in community to community, given the interests and issues of each community. Is that kind of purposeful because activists have learned from the past? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think what activists and organizers would tell you now is that they are people who have studied certainly the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, folks like the Black Panthers, SNCC, and all the multitude of organizations and individuals over the course of the mid 20th century who led that iteration of our country's fight for Black liberation. And so often those organizations and those movements are led by sort of singular Black male figures, with whom the movement, one who come to embody and personify a movement that is actually much bigger than them. And then it also risks something happening to that person or figure in a way that would potentially compromise the entirety of a movement, right? And we've seen iterations of that.
Sure.
And I think that the activists and organizers now are trying to have create a more expansive understanding and definition of like what Black liberation looks like. That it is not, that it includes the plurality of Black people, that it includes Black queer people, Black trans people, Black people with disabilities, and that we cannot do this sort of like, okay, this group of Black people will get some rights, but not this group of Black people.
Right.
And it also is primarily led by women. And I think that the sensibilities that shape what the priorities are and how folks engage with it are different, because there's a different set of political sensibilities and a different understanding of what is necessary in this moment. That is again trying to like expand upon the work that previous generations have done and say like, this was great, this was helpful. Also, we're going to take the best of what we learned from SNCC and the best of what we learned from the Black Panthers and the best of what we learned from CORE and all these other organizations, and we're also going to leave behind some of the elements of it that we don't think were helpful, and try to build a larger, more holistic and inclusive activist community.
Yeah, that's a really good point about it being female led, because I think of past movements, civil rights movements, human rights movements, and other than movements that were specifically to benefit women, women's reproductive rights, suffrage, etc. They probably were. I don't know what I'm talking about, but mostly led by men. This is not an issue that is primarily for women. This is an issue that is primarily for Black folks in this country, and so that's a really good point that I haven't really. I guess I didn't really know that, much less have thought about. We'll think about it more. You go to a bunch of different places, like I said, for your book. Getting back to the book, How the Word is Passed, so good. I'm learning so much. I wish I could have been there for some of these visits. Someday I want to go on a field trip with you or a research trip with you. But you go to a couple plantations that you write about. You probably went to more. And before I get specifically to them, you write in the book, I think, a thoughtful kind of contextual framing, which is, I wonder how this would have been if I wasn't a Black man. You went on tours with other people as part of your research and journalism for this. And some things happened, including at the cemetery, the Blandford Cemetery, with a flyer that wouldn't have happened, I'm guessing, if I were you, even though we look a lot alike, bald and bearded. You wouldn't be treated the same in many of these situations, I'm guessing. How do you think, what perspective do you think you got, or maybe lost, being a Black man doing the work?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the places I went, with the exception of a handful, some included in the book, some not, I was the only Black person there. I was the only Black person present. I am acutely aware of the fact that my presence in a place, especially a place that is tied to the history of slavery, will shape what words people use, what framing they use, what they might say, what they might not say, the inflection that their voices might have used if I was there or not there. I mean, this book, and this is what I write about, at the end, this book is not at all a definitive portrait of each place, right? This book is my experience going to each of these places at any given time. And the way that I experience it is shaped by who my tour guide was that day, what their identity was, what the other members who the other people on the tour were, whether I was with a group, whether I was alone, and so a multitude of different factors would shape, and that includes the fact that I'm a Black man, right? And I think it includes, it is shaped by the way that I speak and the way that I look and the assumptions people make about me when, I tell them where I went to school, and, also all of these things kind of coalesce and come together. And yeah, when I'm at Blandford having conversations with these neo-Confederates, the way that they engage me will almost undoubtedly be different than how they would have engaged you. I read it after I finished the book, but Tony Horwitz's book Confederates in the Attic, which is trying to do a sort of similar project to me in some ways. That he is, the late Tony Horwitz, who passed
I interviewed him, and then he passed away suddenly, a month after. It was
my gosh,
really tragic. But go ahead.
So Confederates in the Attic is this, pretty legendary book from the 90s where Tony Horwitz goes and, spends time with and lives with and goes on all these journeys with these Confederate reenactors. And the way that they speak to him in that book is full of, what is the euphemism? Full of a candor that I would not encounter.
Right. Did you ever have, during your book, did anybody, including in Blandford, did anybody walk up to you like, "Hey there, pal, what brings you to these parts? How you doing there, buddy?"
It was never as
a shitty comedy film movie.
I mean, it was clear at Blandford. And so when I was at Blandford, for context for folks, Blandford is the largest Confederate cemetery one of the largest Confederate cemeteries in the country. The remains of over 30,000 Confederate soldiers are buried there. And I went there for the Sons of Confederate Veterans Memorial Day celebration. And so
as one does.
And I didn't go alone. I actually went with my wife. Wouldn't let me go by myself. So she was like, "You got to take a good friend of mine who's white.
She's
Billy.
White.
She was like, "You take a white friend." And so I took my white friend, and we went, and it was just so such an interesting experience and such a clarifying experience, because you get a sense of how the story, the way that people understand history, is shaped not by primary source documents or empirical evidence or deep engagement with historiography or scholarship. It's based on a story that they're told, and a story that they tell. It's an heirloom. It's a eulogy. It is a family tradition. It is part of a lineage. It is a story that they can't disentangle from the experience of sitting on great granddaddy's lap and having him sing songs that are sort of wedded in this to a nostalgic experience and an experience of love that people have a difficult time disentangling, right? So when your great grandpappy would tell you about all the amazing people, who fought in this war, and you love this person so much, and then somebody's asking you to reject everything that your great grandpappy has told you, and that the people that he was telling you about and that the people he celebrates are people who fought a war to perpetuate the institution of human bondage for millions and millions of Black people. Many people, not all, but there are a lot of people who reject that, and who then try to make it so that to both defend their great grandfather, and to defend their lineage, and in doing so to defend themselves, because who they are in the world is so entangled in those stories that they've grown up with.
But the stories are lies, or they're I don't know what you would call them. You don't know that they're lies, but they're not true. They were made up. It's like the telephone game. It's like my dad always likes to tell us that our family owned a castle in Sicily. He told the story like 10 times. And finally, like a couple of years ago, I was just like, dude, if our family owned a castle in Sicily, why did they leave? And he just stared at me. It's like, why did they leave and live in like a 2-bedroom house in Syracuse?
Right.
But the point is, these aren't true stories, yet these people believe them and argued with you. And people, I mean, they're on TV, they're in Congress arguing about history. I mean, they're in academia, they're everywhere, and they're not true, Clint. I mean, there's so many falsehoods that get passed down generation to generation, as you teach us in the book.
I mean, I think what's interesting is that we are seeing, and you alluded to this, but like, obviously right now we are seeing a sort of gaslighting, not, even beyond the Trump presidency, in ways that, maybe some people didn't necessarily anticipate. But like, even thinking about January 6th and how people are attempting to now tell us that this thing we saw wasn't actually what we saw.
Yeah.
And it's like, but we all watched it. There's video. They like, we saw the whole thing happen.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing that happened after the Civil War. Like, it was this 19th century iteration of the Lost Cause. The vice president of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, had this really infamous, what's called the Cornerstone speech in 1861, where he basically said that the cornerstone of the Confederacy, of this new nation, was the inferiority of the African and the attempt to perpetuate human bondage. And then after the war ended in 1865, people went back to him and they were like, well, what do you have to say for yourself? Like, you said that the cornerstone of the Confederacy was the perpetuation of slavery. And he was like, I never said that. And they're like, what do you mean? It's in the papers. We were there. And he was like, they must have misquoted me. I never said anything like that. Like, no, that's not me. I never said that. And so it's the same playbook. Yeah. Right. And we're, and a lot of folks are starting to think about, like, is the big lie the new 21st century iteration of the Lost Cause?
Yes. Yes, it is. It's exactly emblematic, symbolic of it, for sure. It's just the difference is, as you said, we have video.
Right.
They didn't have photography and video like that at the time, but we also have social media, I suppose, that you can just make up a new story and spread a lie just as fast. I'm almost running out of time here, and I want to ask you about a couple more places that you went, including Africa. Why did you go to Africa? Had you ever been to Africa? And where did you visit? And what did you learn? This is a great chapter. Sorry for the general questions, but take me wherever you want.
Yeah, no. So I went to Dakar, Senegal, and a small island off the coast of Dakar called Gorée Island. And so I had studied abroad in Senegal in college. And so I had a specific sort of nostalgic relationship and affinity for this place that was a really transformative experience for me in so many ways. But I go to Gorée Island because when I went there as a college student, I got this tour of what's called the House of Slaves on Gorée Island, which is this home not especially large or lavish necessarily, but was this home built centuries ago, and that were told at the time was the place where millions and millions of enslaved people walked out of this door, like onto a plank and into these ships that would send them across the Atlantic. And you see the sort of chambers where people were held, the rooms where they were kept. And then I went back and wanted to sort of re-engage with that place, and they call it the door of no return in the House of Slaves. And what you learn is that it actually wasn't millions of enslaved people who were sent from this home. It was more like 30,000, which, to be sure, is still an extraordinary number of people to be sold from anywhere. I mean, as the curator of the House of Slaves says himself when I interview him, he's like, well, one slave is too much. And he's right. But part of what I wrestle with when I'm there is, well, what does it mean, and what are the implications of this place, having said that like millions of enslaved people or captured Africans were sent from here when it was actually tens of thousands? And does that matter? And how do we think of a place's symbolic value in relationship to a sort of empirical truth? And what is can a single place serve as a symbol for a larger set of truths? And what are the responsibilities that a place has to consider how to put both of those things together? And then I also spent some time with students in Senegal, because I wanted to understand like how West African, I've been thinking a lot about how I was taught about slavery, how people in the US are taught about slavery. But I was like, how are like young West African children taught about the history of slavery, and other Africans who sold other Africans into bondage? Mind you, you always have to caveat that by saying that, like, because sometimes that's an idea that's used in bad faith, right? Like, well, black people sold black people into slavery, so like, why are you so mad at white people? And
well,
it's like,
or you hear they had it better here than they did there,
right?
Which
exactly.
Is both of those are I want to fight people.
Yeah, and so to the first point, it's like, well, one, conceptions of like blackness being this sort of inherent thing that ties people together is like very much a westernized construction, and like a westernized racial construction that was meant to in part perpetuate human bondage and create a specific racial hierarchy. And so like Africans had no sense of like blackness being the thing that tied them together, in the same way that like, Britain and France were fighting wars for centuries and had nobody was ever like white, the white people fighting their white brothers to, because and it's the same thing for Africa, where you had different ethnic groups, different tribes, different cultures who fought wars, who had prisoners of war, and who sold those prisoners of war for goods to Europeans, but also who had little sense of that they were selling what was a prisoner of war into intergenerational chattel bondage. Like, that is a very specifically U.S. and Western phenomenon in ways that didn't exist back in West Africa.
I feel like there aren't parallels in current day America to that, but I do want to get your take on, I often feel about like the 7 black intellectual academics or pundits who get referred to so often that are exceptions to, other black thought leaders, the movement in general, your Candace Owens or Larry Elders or Alan West, or these types of people. And I look at them as a white person. I always say to my white friends is like, if you just ask black people what they think, and I realize that's making it seem like that, the black folks think monolithically, but overwhelmingly black folks do think a certain way about race and racism and have their own life experiences. And I wonder what you think about those kind of exceptions to the rule, those types of people who are so anti what we would call the civil rights movement of today.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important, as you said, to recognize the plurality and heterogeneity of black, political, social dispositions and ideologies. And, with somebody like Candace Owens, I mean, it's hard to say.
But like, just not about her, like the denial from black people, the denial of systemic racism, the denial of that certain things are racist.
I think part of the insidiousness of white supremacy is that it forces many black people to internalize a message that this country sends to them, right? Which is this idea, like, I was inundated with these messages as a kid, right? Like, I grew up in New Orleans, and people were like, New Orleans is the murder capital of the nation, and like, those people don't know how to act, and it was never said like the black people don't, but like New Orleans was a majority black city, and it was clearly implicit within what people were saying. And so there was this, we're inundated with these messages about the sort of culture of pathology that was embedded into the social and cultural infrastructure of the black communities in New Orleans. And if you are never, and this goes back to like why I tried to write a book like this, because if you are never given the tools and the history and the framework and the language to understand that so much of what you're being told is a lie, to understand that the reason this community looks one way and this community looks another way, it's not because the people in said community have done anything wrong or that there is anything wrong with them, but it is because of state-sanctioned efforts over the course of decades and generations that have allotted resources to certain communities and stripped them away from others. And once you realize that, I think about, for myself, like, it's so profoundly emancipatory. It's so liberating. It's so it takes off these like shackles almost of like of a sort of paralysis where you like don't know, that what somebody's saying is wrong, but you don't know how to say it.
Right.
And at its worst, to bring it back to your point, at its worst, I think you internalize it and then begin to perpetuate the messages that white supremacy has told you about yourself, and you become a mouthpiece for the very things that you've been told.
It's hard to sometimes relate to that. As I mean, my own kind of awakening in education over the last 20 years has been, liberating the way you describe it, but it wasn't ever about me. Like, it wasn't ever about somebody like me, or to me now as a white straight guy, who's not religious. Like, I just saw other people experiencing that. And so my, I guess, last question would have to be about what a similar, you go to all these different places and you talk about the monuments that are up. And I want you to just take on the argument that people want to erase history with the taking down of these monuments. But more importantly, what does it do to a young black boy, young black girl, who walks into a school named after a Confederate soldier, who lives on a street, who goes to a park, who sees statues of Confederate generals? What did it do to you in New Orleans? What does it do to young black kids now in terms of what they think, what they believe?
So there's the first part of your question. I think that there are there are two things, right? So I think that Confederate statues are like the low-hanging fruit of this debate. Like, there actually is very little argument. I can't think of an argument that would persuade me that a Confederate statue should remain up in a public. If you want to put a Confederate statue up in your backyard, that's your business, right? But like a Confederate
statue, I have a
statue,
few, by the way, but they're just we paintball them and shoot arrows just to teach the kids. But that's
fair enough.
They're hard to get.
But like, there's no excuse for a statue of a group of people who were traitors to the United States and who fought a war to perpetuate the institution of chattel slavery. Those people, or anything honoring them or seemingly venerating them, should not be in a public place paid for by taxpayer dollars. It just is. It's very simple. And I include, like, there's no plaque to like contextualize it. No, like, they should be taken down because their very existence was predicated on expanding and perpetuating slavery.
Yeah.
And so for me, that's an easy thing. And it's like, we actually don't have to have a very extensive debate on it.
No, we don't. But they should be replaced with lessons, as they have in New Orleans.
And I think that
part, yeah.
But there are good faith debates that can be had about other people. Like, I think that right now New Orleans is experiencing a lot of debates around what schools should be renamed and which shouldn't. Like, people are debating whether or not my school should be renamed, my high school, Ben Franklin, because Ben Franklin was not as an enslaver, but used the labor of enslaved people on occasion at his printing shop, I believe is what it was. So does that mean that a statue, what do you do with a statue or the name of Ben Franklin, or and I think that people of good faith can have different opinions on that. Where I come down, like, I don't think the name of that school should be changed, but I also don't think it's wrong for someone to think it does, right? Because, like, I think that it means there's a difference between like fighting your entire sense of like who you were being like predicated on fighting to expand and perpetuate this institution than like somebody, folks like Grant and Franklin and Lincoln and others who like didn't always have very good ideas of around race and around Black equality or lack thereof, but who I think there are more extensive conversations to be had, and people can come down in different ways, and it doesn't mean that either is necessarily wrong. So I think, you just try to like extend generosity and empathy and listen to folks in the same way that, like, I can't. What does it mean to be a young Indigenous child walking past the statue of Andrew Jackson, right? Like, I, who, like the architect of the Trail of Tears, and in the middle of New Orleans, there's a huge Jackson statue. We took down several Confederate statues, but there's still a huge statue to Jackson. There was a bust of Jackson in the Oval Office of the White House until a year ago.
Yeah,
until 5 months ago. And so I think that there are conversations to be held, and I think a lot of it depends on local context and the wishes of.
But what happened? The second part of my question, I agree with you. That's a great answer, and several ideas can be held in your head at one time. But what about the other part, where if a Black kid goes to a school, lives on a street, goes to a park, it's named at, what does that do to them? What does it do when you walk in a school every day? It must make you question a lot if you even understand the history of the name.
Well, I think that's the thing, right? For so long, so many Black children didn't and continue not to understand who the people were that the school is named after. So in New Orleans, there's a school called McDonough. There's many McDonough schools, but like McDonough 35 is like a popular one. And John McDonough was a huge segregationist and enslaver in New Orleans. But there were like dozens of schools that were named after him in the 19th century and in the early 20th century. And I didn't learn that John McDonough was the person that he was until maybe a couple of years ago, right? So like it didn't. I think there's the way that you are able to see the world again when you are taught this history and how you understand yourself in relationship to the world. Because again, what happens is that when you realize who that person is, or in my case, like Robert Mills Lusher, who was a leader in the Confederacy and is the name, and that's who my middle school is named after. You learn that, and then you're able to put that fact in conversation with why the landscape of educational inequity looks the way that it does. Because statues and names and symbols are not just statues and names and symbols. They are reflective of stories that we tell. And those stories embed themselves into narratives that societies carry. And those narratives shape public policy, and public policy shapes the material conditions of people's lives. And so the symbols have implications that are deeply embedded in the sort of larger social, political, and economic infrastructure of any given community. And so that's not to say that taking down a statue of Robert E. Lee or renaming Jefferson Davis School is going to reduce the racial wealth gap, but it is part of a larger project of reckoning and thinking about what priorities of places have or have not been in order to build ultimately a more just society.
And we didn't get to all the places that you had been in writing this book. We got to do a part 2 when the media frenzy is over. I really appreciate you joining me during the initial launch, including June. We didn't get to talk about Juneteenth, but everybody has to get this book, How the Word is Passed, A Reckoning with the History of Slavery Across America. Clint, it's been fun to watch you progress in your life and your career since I met you several years ago at the Aspen Ideas Fest, and you're just kicking ass, and I'm learning so much. I love following you on Twitter. I loved reading this book. And just would you advise aspiring writers and academics to pursue a PhD and write an important book at the same time?
I would not, and don't have 2 kids at the same while you're trying to do all of it either.
Oh my God! I didn't really. Oh my goodness!
Yeah, no, it's been a wild couple of years, but
well, congratulations and enjoy those kids, and thank you so much for spending some time with me today. Congrats, man.
I appreciate it. Thanks so much, Pete.